Welcome back to Business 150, Introduction to Management. And what are we looking at today? We are looking at video number 3 in Module 7 on decision making. And as you can tell in this title slide, I have called this the classic model. The classic model of decision making. This is what we have been hearing and taught about decision making for decades now, how managers are supposed to do it. And let's just acknowledge right up front, this classic model is an optimal dream that doesn't really happen in the real world, but it is a good place to start our discussion on the best practices in decision making. And therefore, we hope that after this video, you'll be able to, one, describe this classic decision model that we have had around for decades, as well as define evidence-based management, which is a suggested consideration for managers, a way to conduct decisions and conduct yourself, in fact, within a corporate culture in order to maximize optimal decision making. So let's get started. When we look at the way that decisions are made, the classic model prescribes that managers should make decisions and how we ought to do it, that we should be logical and rational individuals who make decisions that are in the best interests of the organization. And ideally, this is the kinds of things we would keep at the forefront of our mind. We would not bring in our own personal biases and emotion. We would act on the facts, ma'am, nothing but the facts. And we would be logical and rational, making decisions that seek always to optimize the best interests of the organization. And therefore, this is what the classic decision model typically looks like. When I'm faced with a decision situation, managers should obtain perfect and complete information, eliminate all uncertainty, evaluate everything rationally and logically, and therefore end up with a decision that best serves the interests of the organization. That's the way that we hope that it'll work, the way that it's supposed to work, the way that the classic decision model suggests we ought to conduct our decision making. So let's see if we can give you some examples of these things. Here's an optimal textbook, academic textbook example of rational decision making. Number 1, define the decision, evaluate the problem, identify the problem. What's the example of this? Well, we noticed that over the last period, our turnover is increasing. We can feel it. It just seems like people that were here for a long time, they're all gone now. Something's going on here. So we sense that employee turnover has increased, and we measure it. It's actually increased 5% over what we've typically experienced for the last several years. And turnover is up. And you can see here in the last column, the comments column, production as a result, production is dropping because of the increased turnover. Therefore, we know the turnover rate, you got to get this under control. The turnover rate must be brought back to normal. Okay? Why would production drop because of increased turnover? I think you know this because, one, it takes time to fill slots of folks who have now left the company. It takes some time to find the right candidate, and it takes some time for the right candidate, even if you've got the right candidate, to really slowly work up to the level of production and performance of a more experienced previous employee. So there's several reasons why employee turnover, if it increases, it really does become a problem that you need to identify. And so, number 2, you identify the alternatives. And you see the example column, provide more incentives to retain good employees. Maybe you want to make sure the ones that are still here, that they stay, the good ones. Maybe increased benefits or salaries are possible. And also maybe you want to improve your HR hiring standards and screening. In other words, you want to try and stem any tide of people being dissatisfied with the workplace and also do a better job in the long run of making sure that as you hire people, that they are really qualified and really able to be loyal to the organization. Now, some comments there. Both obvious and creative options are desired at this point. You want to consider all the alternatives, all possible alternatives, both the clear, easy, obvious ones, as well as something maybe a little outside the box. And the number of alternatives that you require in order to move to the next step is probably going to depend upon the severity and the urgency of the problem, right? If it's a really urgent problem, you got to get solved now. And quite frankly, if the severity of the problem is great then you also would want to have more possible alternatives to weigh rather than just one or two. So, number 3, we have some options now. So now you want to evaluate the options. And in evaluation, we have that evaluation process that I suggested from the last video, right? Of the kinds of questions you want to ask. Is it feasible? Is it satisfactory? Are the consequences affordable? Okay, now, so as you evaluate these options, you realize increasing benefits may actually not be possible at all. Now, increasing wages is possible, and that may reduce turnover. And also, it is possible to improve HR standards and hiring practices, and that may also reduce turnover. And so, at this point, you are evaluating each of the options and analyzed with regards to feasibility, cost, the likelihood of actually solving the problem, and any possible consequences. And from there, step 4, we select what we deem at this point in time to be the best alternative. And in the example problem we have before us, changing HR standards will take too much time to realize improvements. It will help, but just not soon enough. And therefore, we are going to choose the increase in wages. And the goal here is to consider all the situational factors and choose the alternative that best what am I saying there? The alternative that best solves the situation. Okay? So, number 5, we implement the chosen alternative. And in implementing the increase in wages, we find that, we're exceeding our approved budget. So we got to get permission from above. We got to get additional permission. And after we secure that permission, then the plant manager introduces the new wage structure, communicates it out to the salient folks, to the troops. And the comment there, the chosen alternative is implemented into the organizational system. You're not done yet, of course. We made a point of this. The 6th step is evaluating the results. And so you are measuring the results, and you find that 6 months later, turnover has dropped. And actually, turnover has actually dropped slightly below the previous historical level. And the goal here is, it looks like it's successful. It doesn't mean that you necessarily give up on improving HR standards, but it looks like this has solved the problem, and the results should be revisited and monitored on an ongoing basis. Now, that is a textbook, an academic school, college level kind of example, a textbook example of rational decision making. You weigh out objectively and without emotion all of the options, you evaluate them methodically, you get all of the best and perfect information, and you make the call. This is the standard we would like to live up to, and that we realize in the real world sometimes decisions aren't quite made this way. But nevertheless, this provides a classic example of how business decisions can be made to optimize the results. This leads us to then a slightly different discussion, and this is a suggested managerial style, a methodology for your consideration called EBM, or Evidence-Based Management. It is a management methodology whose hallmark is the use of rationality and evidence when making decisions. And so the idea here is to provide a framework and an example and a precedent where leadership and managerial decisions are built based upon rational evidence and the data, not on emotion or personal intuition or those kinds of things. And therefore, you see here the steps. You try to build an ongoing culture of truth, a corporate culture which values the truth, the evidence, and the data. And therefore, the next step is to obtain the best evidence and let the evidence guide your actions. This will, over time, encourage experimentation and learning by doing as you do in light of the evidence and the data. This allows you to look for risks and drawbacks and recommendations based upon the data and the evidence, and therefore you will avoid making a lot of decisions based upon personal belief, feeling, intuition, emotion, those kinds of things. It provides not only a backdrop, but also a foundational bedrock principle of let's go with the data. What does the data suggest? What can we learn from the data? And we have distilled that then, this mindset, this perspective on managerial decision making, we call it evidence-based management. Now, I would tell you there's a great deal of value of trying to create a culture which is somewhat unswayed by the emotion of things, unswayed and not influenced unduly by personal objective emotionality. The evidence many times will not lie. The evidence will provide the actual data with which we must consider and be confronted by and respond to in real life and in real time. So this can be a very, very useful culture to set up. And yet at the same time, we would tell you, there is such a thing as intuition. There is such a thing as your gut feeling proving correct. Now, the data, the evidence surrounding research into intuition really does not suggest that intuition and gut feeling is simply that. It's just simply a sixth sense that guides us in our best moments. The real research into intuition seems to suggest there actually are logical, intuitive, evidence-based reasons why intuition works. It's simply that the person exercising intuition, they do have a logical backdrop and history of data from which they're drawing. It's just simply perhaps difficult for them to articulate all of the data points that they are calling to mind that leads them to a particular decision. They say stuff like, and I may say stuff like that as well, stuff like, I just feel this is the right move. I'm not sure I can explain it, but I feel it's the right move. But the data seems to suggest that if I was given enough time and enough nudging, I actually probably could articulate what I'm thinking, and that it is more times than not rational and evidence-based. It's just I have trouble articulating it in the moment that I need to make the decision. So even then, the suggestion here is that some forms and events that seem to be intuitively based really are based in rationality and a culture of truth and evidence. So some things to consider as we think about this initial classic model, how we make rational, emotionless decisions. So we hope that you will be able to both describe the classic decision model as well as define evidence-based management, or EBM, as we move forward in this discussion on decision making in Module 7. Hope that was helpful. More on all of this, of course, in the textbook, and we will see you in the next lecture.